some tunes. Anyway, welcome everybody. It's 3:30 Pacific time in the US, it's 6:30 in New York, and it's 9:30 a.m. Friday morning here in Melbourne. Welcome to the Supply Chain Bunker. I'm just going to open with a few headlines and a little bit of a story about what's going on in the market at the moment, because we're obviously in rapidly changing times. I'm not going to give the big numbers of cases. We all know what they are. We see them every day on TV. We're all plugged into numerous news services, and we know tragically they're rising too fast. But there are some interesting elements in the story that give us some glimmers of hope and some perhaps opportunities. So it's good to see that China's getting back to work. And we've got a guest dialed in directly from China, Howell Wang, and we'll be talking to him shortly, and we'll get to that and we'll dig in a little bit on that. Other regions are seeing factory closures now, so that further disruption to the supply chain. India and Bangladesh, for example, the whole of India basically shut down for 2 weeks. Big challenges there. And that includes Foxconn facilities that are making Apple products and those kind of things. And again, that's balancing with the fact that a lot of the facilities that were shut down in China are now opening and getting back up to capacity. Some factories in the US have closed, some were temporarily closed, and then some have reopened depending on what projects they're working on. And some are doing a great job of managing those social distancing rules. And I've read some interesting pieces about that and spoken to some factory owners, how they're basically running 3 shifts for a 1-shift capacity, so they can keep that those social distancing rules. And those that have a more automated approach are actually finding some of that social distancing process much easier to apply. Yeah. In the US, Ford, GM, Fiat, Chrysler, Nissan, Hyundai, Volvo, Subaru, Honda have all shut down substantial proportions of their factory. And, they're not making Harleys now, which is temporary, but, not a good thing. But on the flip side, we're seeing manufacturing step up. I think that's really important. We're seeing numerous examples of companies with agile solutions doing a great job. And I think about those in the EMS sector who have always had diverse manufacturing and have had that ability to, make a consumer product one day, a medical product another day, and an aerospace product another day. And I think it's it's really indicative of the skills and the flexibility that industry has, that it's been able to step up and help and switch production where they've needed to, and also to prioritize some of the healthcare clients that they've got. I love that we've seen so much creativity as well. We've got companies like Louis Vuitton making wipes. We've got distillers using equipment that they use to make gin to make hand sanitizer. Great. And we see more and more examples. And then practical examples like 3D printing companies producing essential parts that can accelerate solutions to market where the supply chain's been really, really badly disrupted. Ford partnering with 3M and GE to produce health equipment. Great example. And companies like GM and Tesla pledging to contribute equipment resources and actually switch production where they can. And, it's interesting that you see stuff in the media that, if a factory can make pickup trucks, maybe it can make ventilators. It's actually the suppliers that are making the parts for those pickup trucks that really do have that much more diverse manufacturing solution and can really step up. So the whole supply chain's getting behind it. And I read a story this morning about Chinese factories working 24/7 building ventilators that are being shipped to Milan and New York. So this is a global issue, and the whole global manufacturing ecosystem is getting behind it. And they're doing that individually, and they're doing that collectively. We're seeing trade associations like IPC and SEMI and the other big associations that bring our industry together, connecting with government because they already have that channel there, and connecting back to the industry and saying, hey, these guys have got a really substantial supply capacity, a really substantial manufacturing ability, and they can help. So, there's challenging news. There's stuff that freaks us out every time we switch the TV on. But there's stuff that actually makes me think, okay, as an industry, we can do stuff, and we are doing stuff, and we're getting to it. And I think that's really important. And I want to hand over to Dave and just get a feel for what Dave's been seeing this week out there in the market, and what people have been coming to you asking for.
Well, I love it, Phil. And the purpose of the bunker, again, is to get the best minds from all different angles. I wish you could give me my morning cup of tea and news every day. I think you just saved me an hour of scanning through Flipboard when I go home tonight. So thanks for the updates. I think while Phil shares a lot of the macro of all the different news going around the world, we wanted to open the episode up by, hey, what are we seeing as a manufacturer, and what are some of the trends specifically in China with our team that's there, but as well as with all of our customers across the US. And so I would say the last week, since the last time we were in this bunker, is the amount of inbound requests for PPEs, so personal protective equipment for hospitals, has never been higher for us, of just people asking for help here. We're seeing inbound on valves, on test swabs, ventilators, respirators, nebulizers. And it's just phenomenal to see the amount of folks that are asking for help and trying to connect the dots together. So that's been high. I think some of the pros of this are, we're seeing companies like Phil talked about that have manufacturing abilities, be agile and shift to produce. But we're also seeing a lot of folks try to do open source designs and find new solutions. And I think that there's good and bad things here. And so for the audience, I would really have the call to action that I think the open source projects are good, but we have to remember that there are professionals that have been doing this for decades, studying how to build test swabs and ventilators. And so in some ways, we really need to figure out how to support these professionals more than build new designs, really for the safety of our of our medical professionals. My wife is a pediatrician, so for her, protect my wife. And some of the stats, because I want to make sure folks have take homes, just so you understand the how grave of a situation. New York City said that they only have 4,000 ventilators right now, and they need 30,000 at their current demands. So if you imagine that gap between those two, they're getting another 7,000 from the federal government, but there's a real shortage. There's shortages in masks, valves, test swabs in order to help here as well. But I think the primary topic we wanted to talk about was not COVID. I think everyone is reading enough about this in the news today. It's really on what's the state of China, and how can we leverage China to actually either understand what's the US going to go through, what does the manufacturing ecosystem look like? So I'll share a couple stats with everyone here, and then we're going to have experts talk about it. China's a big country. I'll start off with that. And so there's areas that are really affected still, but even in Wuhan and the Hebei province, they're coming back online. In southern China, we'll have Howell talk about this, but we're seeing production really start to come back. Factories reporting 85 to 90% capacity in a lot of ways. The economy still is trying to recover, and GDP is down as much as 9% in China year over year if you look at Q1 of 2019. But economists are really optimistic that this will be a V-shaped economy in China, that there's a really low dip, but be able to rise. And they're looking at the SARS epidemic in 2003 to help model some of that. Production continues to face disruptions, but is growing. There's a really great report, if folks want to look at it, called the Standard Charter. And they've seen that the capital utilization has risen from 52% up from 42% in February. So we're continuing to really see a rise. Yeah. Some of the ones that I love is Nike's a great example in China. If folks saw this, it reported that it's reopened 80% of its stores already, and there's 7,000 Nike stores in China. But they actually saw an increase in selling shoes even during the entire pandemic in China. So it turns out people want groceries and sneakers at the same time, and Nike did okay. One of the topics, and we'll bring the guests in here, is this idea of geographic resilience that we want to talk about. So how do you build resilience into your entire supply chain based upon geographies? That if you're too focused on just the US, or you're too focused on just, say, China, this doesn't add a lot of resilience. And so even looking at province level or state level versus just country. And so we'll have some experts talk about that here in a second. But as always, I think my hope before we bring it to John, and I'll kick it back over to Phil, is this is supposed to be interactive. So please ask questions. There's a Q&A session or section that you can click on. There's also a general chat that you can drop questions in here that we'll be responding. I see our first one on different 3D printing technologies. But please use that and leverage the experts in the bunker. Phil, I'll give it over to you.
Great update, Dave. And I think it's really interesting. A couple of things you mentioned there. One is that, you know, the community that's coming together to build stuff and as you say, supporting those companies that are very professional, because we want reliable products out in the market, and that thing of using technology to leverage that. So maybe 3D printing something that, you know, that might have been cast in the past, or might have come out of a mold that you don't have access to right now, is a really smart way to go. And then the other thing is that impact we're seeing in terms of retail disruption. And I think that demand disruption, having had a supply disruption, is something that we'll talk about when we've got both John and Howell on. Let's bring in John now. So John, if you can unmute your mic and your camera. John, great to see you. Thanks for joining us in the bunker. It looks like you're in your own little bunker there, safely tucked away. I'll let you do a quick introduction, because you've got a super impressive CV and you know, great knowledge about supply chain, and then we'll open up for a bit of discussion. So just give me the super fast tour.
Who is John?
Who is John?
First of all, thanks, Phil. Thanks, Dave, for having me. It's great to be here in the bunker, the virtual bunker, and also in my own bunker, which I enjoy most of the time in. Yeah, so I've got 30 years experience or so running operations and manufacturing product development. Started my career at Ford Motor Company and as a manufacturing engineer, and then moved to California. Did a bunch of startups in California. Ended up one of them was bought by Cisco, so I went from a small startup environment to running a $4 billion manufacturing business for Cisco for some time, and then also while at Cisco, got a chance to get some experience doing some world-class sourcing in that organization. Learned a ton. And then in 2010, a small little company down in Santa Barbara, California called Sonos called me up, and I decided to move from the Bay Area down to Santa Barbara, and I led manufacturing and supply chain for Sonos for 7 years. During that time, we grew from 50 million to $1 billion, and just had an incredible experience, scaling a supply chain and running an operation that big from that small. It was a wonderful experience. Most recently, I decided to take another crack at the startup world and joined Boosted back in 2017, and spent a couple of years with Boosted, leading the operation. And unfortunately, as anybody that's been reading the news lately, unfortunately, Boosted ran out of funding last month, and so and I actually had left in January. So learned a lot at Boosted. We had some really interesting challenges from a supply chain standpoint that I can talk a little bit about. But most recently, then I've been very active as a supply chain consultant the last couple of months.
Well, so awesome to have you on, and appreciate you taking the time to talk about it. And so maybe we can start there. We'll start at the end, and we can work our way backwards with Boosted. A product that's probably near and dear to a lot of folks watching. It's prolific across the Bay Area as well as I think the country, and it's really too bad that they had to shut down. But maybe could you talk a little bit around the setup of Boosted's supply chain, and how did you leverage Asia and think about R&D and what did that look like?
Yeah, I think the number one thing as I came into the company is the company had been set up by there's some great PhD engineers had been setting up the supply chain. So, obviously they're great at R&D, but just didn't have the experience to set up the supply chain in China. So, the first thing that I was looking for is just to transition the supply chain to a set of partners that could scale and could support us through that growth period. And so it was, as you can imagine, a pretty quick transition from some small non-scalable suppliers to picking a whole new set of suppliers that could achieve the quality and the scale that we were hoping for. And really the initial supply chain was really around the electric skateboard, and the big push was how to grow and expand that business, and how to go from essentially one product company to expanding the product line. And so the first thing we did was we introduced 4 new SKUs in the electric skateboard, and brought on a new contract manufacturing partner and a whole bunch of other great supplier partners, and really did the thing that most startups have to do, which is very, very quickly develop products and get them to market and launch successfully, and then get ready to reload and do the next product. And in our case at Boosted, it was the electric scooter.
Yep. Did you know that China was your go-to? Like, did you walk in, you said, hey, we're definitely gonna keep building this skateboard in China, and that was just an obvious for you?
Yeah, it really is. And it really is when you look at what you need in terms of the supply chain and the core components and where the capabilities are, China just is the place to go. And it has been now for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
sorry, is that because of the manufacturing capacity they have there, or is that further down the supply chain? Is that the other tiers that
it's actually a number of things. I mean, I think back early in my career when China happened, and I was working for Ford when really China started to take off, and it was just like suddenly you had a workforce that was essentially free. I mean, labor was so cheap as a percentage of the product cost that all of a sudden you could just throw out all the design rules and just go to China and just throw a bunch of people at it, and that's what happened. So so what's happened in China over the course of my career is you go from just it's a cheap place to build to what it is today, which is it's just where all the capability is right now. It's where all the capacity is.
Yeah.
And it's there was a point in time when you had to worry about getting quality components and products out of China, and it's just over the last decade it just has really grown up. Much like Hong Kong did, much like Japan did after World War II. I mean, it's really a very similar trend that we've seen play out here over the last 40 years.
And so is the first thing then, so you come in, who's really smart PhDs, they built all this product, it's awesome, but they probably have just a smorgasbord of different suppliers. And so is the first job to consolidate it down, or maybe walk through those first initial decisions for other people that are going through this?
I think it wasn't so much consolidating, it was just more like replacing. I mean, you go from a proto shop that it's a tiny little place that has some die casting capability or has some
mom and pop
mom and pop thing to finding somebody that's mid-sized and able to really step up on the quality side. Mm-hmm. And those are the kinds of things that you have to do. And really one of the most painful things, in addition to finding new suppliers and launching new suppliers and building new relationships in the supply chain, was it also forces the engineering team to really grow up fast. Because when you're dealing with little companies and mom and pop, they'll take whatever you give them in terms of specs, drawings, and all that kind of stuff. And so, and so here you are, you're going to these, professional, scalable companies, and they're like, wait a minute, where's the critical function dimensions? Where, what are the real requirements here? How do we ensure that we're going to be able to get yields here? And how do we deal with all the, issues that come up with just not fully speccing apart, as you go.
Yeah.
So, like that.
So when you do that, John, is that about putting processes in? Is it about getting software in there? What do you do to improve that MPI process and that whole supply chain management?
I think it's all the above. I mean, it really is. It's a function of fixing and improving the suppliers you're doing business with and increasing the capability there. It's also improving your own NPI and engineering process, so that you're adding some discipline around how you're managing changes, how you're communicating designs to the supply base, all those kinds of things, all the above.
And did you find that it sounds like it was as much as finding better partners for you to work with, as well as educating, a growing company like Boosted then in these processes, it sounds like?
Yeah, absolutely. Very much so.
are there big lessons, like as you sit back, you spent a couple of years with them now, like, and if you were to do it again, this is one of the questions from Paul,
Yeah.
so thank you. You know, like what would you do differently? You know, if you were to walk in day one at Boosted, what would be something you'd change?
I think, I mean, there's a number of things that I look back on that I'd do differently. And I think if I tie it into what's happening in the world right now, I think the number one thing is that I think I'd look for a more diversified footprint. I just think that, I mean, what we got hit by really badly at Boosted was the tariff that just hit.
Right.
So suddenly I have a small team that I've built in China. I've got a good supply chain that we're putting together and building, and we're making lots of progress in terms of getting costs down, and our gross margins starting to look good. And then all of a sudden, out of left field comes this 25% tariff that hits us at a time when, you know, we're needing to raise money. You know, we're trying to get our margins. We just don't have the resources to go out and say, okay, we're going to put all of our NPI on hold and we're going to go move the supply chain, you know, somewhere else. I mean, you just don't have the luxury of being able to make those kind of decisions. You have to use one or the other.
So does that create a demand for more agility in the supply chain or a more diverse supply chain? Which is it, both of those, or is it one in particular?
I think it's both. And what's hard is it's hard when you're a small company to do that. You know, obviously when you're a Cisco, you know, you have tons of resources. You got a footprint all over the globe. You've got, you know, you just got massive capability to deal with contingency. And in a small company environment, startup environment, I mean, you only have a couple of arrows in your quiver. You know, you have to figure out how to make the most of it. And it's really tough.
And so
and they're very different, aren't they? Sorry, Dave.
We've talked about this agility, which I think is great. And you actually did some of this though, right, John? And in terms of when the tariffs hit and how you thought about moving to other geographies, maybe you can walk through that lesson for folks.
Right. So I mean, we were just because of what we were dealing with and the impact on the margins, we, you know, even though we didn't have resources, we still, you know, made an effort to try to figure out some way, quick and dirty, how we might be able to get up another factory up and running outside of China. Mm-hmm. So in this case, I basically just hired an outside, you know, consultant. You know, literally it was me, the consultant, and a couple of folks on his team, you know, going around to Indonesia and Malaysia and you know, Southeast Asia.
You're on vacation is what you're saying.
Yeah, right. Looking for a way to make it, you know, somehow figure out how we could. And at this time, we were like literally looking at how could we ramp the scooter in China, and literally as soon as that's stable, figure out how to get pieces of it shipped into Malaysia so that we could reassemble and ship back to the U.S. that way. And we, you know, we went through that planning process and had a plan that came together, but unfortunately we just didn't have the volume once we launched the scooter to justify it.
Did the skateboard ever go through Malaysia at all, or
no? That actually leads to a really interesting thing. So as soon as the tariff hit, we filed for an exemption on the electric skateboard, and we're actually granted, you know, an exemption.
Wow.
Unfortunately, it was we weren't granted that until like more than a year after we'd been producing the product. So the U.S. government actually owed us about $4 million, as it turns out, in tariff refund.
Wow.
Okay.
And we never got that back. And what we found there is that there's just such a nightmarish bureaucracy to deal with that it just, you know, getting it back was just going to take, it literally could take anywhere up to 9 months to a year to get the money back.
Yeah. So even after you'd got the exemption, the tariffs were still hurting you because it was such an impact on cash flow for an innovative company.
Exactly. And when you're a little company like Boosted, you know, $4 million, that's a big deal.
Yeah. I think, John, since you mentioned that you hired a consultant in Asia to help you out, it's a good time to bring Howell into the conversation. I know he's waiting and ready to go, and we've already seen a couple of questions. So Howell, come join us.
Hey, everyone. I am Howell, and actually I stayed in the manufacturing industry for about 20 years. Firstly, I worked for Foxconn Flex as program manager, supply chain manager, really deep in the production line. roll our sleeves to work with all of the people to work for, to delivering good products. When I was in Flex and Foxconn, the most important clients for us are Motorola and Cisco. And later on, I switched to OEM brand company named Jabra, which is a Bluetooth headset company in Copenhagen. And I was the commercial manager, product cost manager, really, identify the cost down opportunities, find out what the alternative solution to make the profit level without impact the quality performance. 10 years ago, I joined a consulting company in Silicon Valley named River Solutions. And we work with lots of startups. From 10 years ago to now, I work with almost 120 startups. Wow. And really, got a lot of good stories, how they start, how they define the supply chain, how they map out the capabilities to integrate it with suppliers' capabilities, so that they can utilize each other's advantages. And recently, we are helping lots of suppliers as well as clients to make better products and expediting the schedule, verify the risks, and avoid crisis.
Yeah, and you've been through a bit of a crisis, and you've been in the thick of it. So I just really wanted to start by having you kind of set a little bit of the scene by telling me kind of what happened from kind of Chinese New Year onwards, and what you've seen in terms of impact, and what you've been working on specifically with clients, and then we'll kind of broaden out from there.
Yeah, unfortunately, just because of this epidemic, China manufacturing and supply chain almost like immediately stopped. Everything couldn't move for transportation, for your people, all of the stuff. And but really, I think China moves very quickly, and they have more than 10,000 factories making PPE products. Wow. To help work and production resumption. And from the monitoring data of the government, last week, the electricity and water usage is back to the same level as last year at the same time. So really, I think the situation got much better, but lots of small factories, they were affected because they don't have stable clients. Some of their clients canceled the orders. So the demand really is downside, and they really struggling for new orders. And also they don't have real core competence in the industry. So I think if the clients, for example, they start up and they don't have too much demand, and they don't have a strong financial background, then I think they may need to concern about the small suppliers' financial business status. And I think it's good to assess that. But for the big companies like TK Mold, this kind of plastic factory, they have stable orders. They have long relationships, stable market. So I think they don't need to worry about that, and the clients shouldn't really concern about that too much.
Yeah. So I mean, a good example, an example we all know is Foxconn. They closed factories throughout China, and now they're getting back to capacity. And now they've got disruption in India, where they've closed their facility there. What are you seeing at that very top end in terms of them getting back to capacity? And I know they've shifted some production to masks and different things, but are they pretty much back where they are, and most of the workforce back at the factory?
Yeah, as information I got from my older colleagues in Foxconn, 85% workers are back. And because they are using lots of robotics and also they prioritize the production to different urgent demand. So I think it's in a good shape now. Probably they need 2 to 4 weeks, but I think at the end of April, everything should be fine.
Cool. And maybe I'll take one question that came in here from Sai, asking about resources for all the caveats of sourcing from China. You've worked with so many different startups. What resources would you push people towards to learn around all the different nuances for leveraging China and really starting to break in there, whether you're a founder or, you know, an experienced executive? What are some of the best resources to maybe figure that out?
I think the first thing they would need to do is to really define their supply chain strategy and their supply chain network from beginning, because low-cost region absolutely is an attractive point. But I think you know, they need to balance the supply chain security, quality, cost competitiveness, but also, you know, the supply chain efficiency. So really, it's a kind of a matrix they need to figure out, you know, what things they do that by themselves, what they use suppliers, you know, competence to help them out. Don't try to use all their own resources to figure that out. You know, sometimes like a prototype, they, you know, find different suppliers, assess them, and that really take longer time to figure out which one is good. I think spending some money in prototype and MPI stage would absolutely is, I think, valuable.
So when you look at that process, do you think that's a process that startups can manage on their own, or is it about figuring out how to partner? I mean, actually just going out there and looking for a whole bunch of different suppliers is very, very challenging.
John probably knows that.
And obviously, yeah, John knows that from his own experience. So interesting to hear that from John. And John actually obviously has done it directly, has done it with partners as well. And obviously, Howell, you're helping companies do that as well. How important? Let's take that from John first. How important is it to have a partner?
I think building partnerships is the key to being successful in China. And I think the way that you go about it is, I think for startups, I think you can't underestimate how important it is to have somebody on the team that has some experience setting up a supply chain or working with China from the get-go. Because what ends up happening is you just need to spend time in China. You need to understand and learn and get to know the people that you're doing business with. Because what I've found, at least, is that it's such a you know, personal relationships mean so much in doing business in China. Because when you're a small company, one of the things that I always say is, hey, you need friends. You need people that can help you, and you need to be able to pick up the phone and call and have somebody recognize you on the other end and is willing to put resources and help you out. Because when you're small and you're growing, you're going to make mistakes. Things are going to happen to the business, and you're just going to need a lot of consideration. So building those kind of relationships are you know, job one, I guess, when it comes to sourcing and startups.
Yeah, and I think that's huge. And I was just going to say to you, Dave, it's you need friends, absolutely. And I feel that, you know, even though we're spread around the world, we're all friends here in the bunker, but you need boots on the ground, and that's really important, isn't it? You know, I don't know who wants to take that, but I think having that expertise that can be in the factory day in, day out is essential.
Absolutely.
I think it can never be more critical. And I think what's important is that there's a variety of ways to do that. I'm sure John would tell you about it, the Cisco days or Sonos, the size of the teams that do those, to what does a scrappy startup even be able to spend, and then Howell has helped supplement, I think, in a lot of different ways. And even at Fictiv, you know, we do something similar. We apply technology. We have 35 folks that are boots on the ground in China, because I think, like you said, John, you need friends.
Yeah, and it boosted. I think I had, you know, I think sourcing, quality, and say factory management, maybe 8 people in China, covering all of East China and all of South China. In terms of supply chain. So.
And so how have you guys helped make friends for companies in China? Or, you know, what's the advice that you would give for the best way to try and build that out with so much expertise?
Yeah, actually, I think I totally agree with you, John and Dave. Hiring experienced people, really let them do what they are good at. I think it's really important. Also, I think it's very important. Just to show yourself there, show up you're there, and don't be I think um, don't be too much dreamful stuff, and just to show them realistic world what it is, and what's your real business status. Don't hide important information behind. Otherwise, the personal relationship, the business relationship will be affected later. I think just to try to be open, honest, direct. And I think a lot of Chinese partners, they like this kind of style.
Yeah, Howell's exactly right, and I found the same. It's all about trust, and how quickly can you build trust, and when you build trust by being open and real. If you go in there and you tell your supplier you're going to be, selling 1 million units next quarter, and then you don't, you just damage your credibility beyond belief. I mean, you have to be really, open about what the real business is going to be and what the risks are.
Yeah, I sometimes feel there's an issue there of culture and language, and I don't mean between us and China. I mean between startups and manufacturers. Yeah. When you're a startup, you speak a very different language to a manufacturer. You're not an engineer that's concerned about detail and process and give me actual numbers. You're excited about a product, and that passion is part of creativity and innovation, and it's hugely important. But that has to follow through into something that the manufacturer can say, okay, this is an innovator that I want to work with. And Dave, you talk about radical transparency all the time. You've got to do that in a complex network.
Well, I actually want to double click on this topic, because now it's never been more important, I think, to talk about this idea of trust, because China is actually getting ready to shut down all foreigners coming in starting this weekend. And if you do come in, you have to be quarantined for, a long period of time. And so I would imagine that other countries are going to follow suit. And so I'm curious both from John and how do you think companies should navigate in China during a time like this? If you're not able to actually fly there and be boots on the ground, maybe Howell, we'll start with you. Any advice for how to navigate, these specific times that we're in?
I think there are a few things can do. One, I think as soon as you can, hire some consultants to really send the people to verify the risks and define the mitigation plan. Really define the executable action plan. Other than you said something they didn't follow in reality. So I think this is one. Second one, can work with the supplier to optimize the product features and some assembly process. That is a good thing to do, because you couldn't travel here, but you may be humble and ask them to provide you proposals, how they can reduce the cost, how they can reduce the cycle time, and how do they improve the yield rate. I think this is the second thing to do. The third thing, I think they can figure out what the liabilities they may reduce, like, cancel some long lead time parts, reduce the inventory, liabilities, also some E&O parts. If you can resell it. Just, keep your cash going.
Yeah. And how about you, John? Any advice, in these kind of highly dynamic times, and now not being able to actually fly in there? Anything you would do if you were in an operator's role right now?
Yeah, I think number one is I'd still make sure that I'm still talking to my partners, right? I mean, even if I can't travel, I can WeChat and stay close that way, just so that there's a good, robust line of communication. And then the other thing I just say is, don't be afraid to ask for help. Ask your supplier for help. Tell them what your problem is. I've been amazed at just putting the problem on the table to your supply chain, your partners, how creative the solutions can come up, and they'll help you think of things that you can't think of yourself, I'm sure.
Could you give an example there? I love that. Like, can you think of one through the career where you said, we just can't solve this, and the factory might have been able to come back and help out?
Yeah, I mean, like for example, if you think about, hey, I've got a quality problem at a supplier, for example. One way to think about it is, oh, well, I have to have a resource to go there myself, and if I can't get that person, then what do you do?
Yeah.
And, a simple example is just go to your contract manufacturer, go to another another supplier that you have a good relationship with who might have extra resources, and see if you can divert some resources, from temporarily to cover it. And I mean, that's one example. There's just many examples of it. It's more of a, I think it's more of a philosophy in terms of how you engage with that kind of philosophy.
And I think right now it's, as you say, Dave, I think those borders suddenly look very robust, don't they? And, what we used to do, and, you and I would regularly jump on planes and cross the Atlantic and Pacific to do different projects. Now we're doing that through these conferencing networks, and we've got to create that intimacy online somehow. But actually, what I think is interesting is there are boots on the ground that are available. So if you can't send someone to China, then figure out who's got someone in China that can help you, because there are people in those factories regularly. And I know with Howell's team, for example, you've got to get in those factories as often as you can, and you've got to be present, and you've got to be updating people constantly. That's a huge part of what you do, right, Howell?
Yeah, I think, recently a few clients asked us to, verify the suppliers' supply chain healthy, especially their sub-supply chain healthy. And, they want to combine some component supplier from 4 to 2, because just too much to manage. And also the schedule sleeping is a risk. So really having people there, stay with the suppliers, encourage them, even sometimes, pay them compensation, expediting fee, really, I think deserves for your business.
Yeah, I think we learned the same thing, that even as a technology company, we write all this software to access China and different parts of the world and the US, but we still have a team of 35 folks of boots on the ground. And so we know the importance of the ability to access isn't just, I think, through technology or webcams or sending reports. You have to be able to smell the coolant in the factory. You need to be able to walk it. And so I love, John, the idea you have that it doesn't even have to be your own employee. It could be your other CM or someone you have a good relationship. I think that's great advice to take away. One of the questions that came in here was, and John, maybe this can be pointed towards you, is on the topic of geography resilience. And so did you ever consider diversifying your manufacturing base to Mexico when the tariff hits? Was that considered? And Jen, thanks for the comment, but maybe why or why not?
Yeah, it's a great question. We considered it, but didn't really consider it very seriously after you just think about some of the situations that we were facing. And I think the biggest thing is that the type of components that we were looking for and the type of suppliers that we were working with were very much around the bicycle industry. And in the center of the world in the bicycle industry is China.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So given that it's a new product, given that we had a very compressed development schedule and had a lot of initial issues when we were starting to ramp the product, it's very, very difficult and risky to consider a long supply chain where you have components being built, say in China, and then you're bringing them into Mexico to do final assembly. You got a very long feedback loop there that could lead to a lot of quality problems that you don't discover until days, weeks after they happen in the component supply chain.
And I know that you considered, with Malaysia's FATP, so final assembly, test and package done in Malaysia. Yeah. Did you ever consider the US or other regions to help with this? Or is it the same kind of labor skill set that you just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, we just did, and again, it was a function of, I'd say, the stability of the product itself, and also just the hard reality of just the lack of resources that we had in the company. To build a team and to do manufacturing in Mexico would require building a team in Mexico, and we just didn't have the resources, because whether it's Malaysia, whether it's China, whether it's Mexico, wherever, one thing's for sure is you can't do this by remote control. You have to have you have to have people that are in region.
Yeah, and that talks to what you mentioned earlier in the Cisco situation, where you do have a team in Penang, you do have a team in Shanghai, you do have a team in Guadalajara, and you can have those boots on the ground everywhere. Howell, is it a case that, you know, as John said, when you're making something that's built of bicycle parts, it's naturally going to be a particular region? You know, if you're in the solar area at the moment, you're up around Shanghai and those areas. Is it really analyzing the product? And sometimes do you have to say, no, this isn't right for China, it should be manufactured in Mexico, or it should be manufactured much more local to the either to the designer or to the consumer?
Actually, I think lots of startups, they didn't do this when they launched their business, and lots of them just quickly found a contract manufacturer and let them organize all of the supply chain. And they really didn't consider, you know, if this supply, they have the diversified manufacturer sites in different regions. And recently, I think more and more clients are considering, you know, Malaysia as a FATP place, and they import goods from, you know, components from China. But for resources, our engineers, really, I think it's the most important, resources they need to consider, because, you know, if you don't have the mature technicians, engineers, all of the operators who work for your product professionally, it will be a big problem. So like recently, a client, they chose the Vietnam as a manufacturer site, but they need to, you know, ask the supplier from Guangzhou to dispatch the engineers every week, and that really hurts the whole schedule.
Yeah, and it hurts the value of the whole supply chain and the value of the process. And as John was saying earlier, you know, when you're doing RF tuning or you're doing anything like that, that expertise becomes as important as the supply chain. So absolutely critical.
And so, John, one of the questions I have is, we've talked all about these small, lean, scrappy teams, right? Of what Boosted has to do, and Howell's talked about these small ones. What if we pop up for a second and we say, hey, take a Cisco, you know, we're both Ford alumni, or we can do that. But maybe Cisco is, okay, they do have geographic resilience, right? That they have all these different sites and people and teams. Are they still at the same risks that, you know, maybe a Boosted is? Or, you know, do they have true geographic resilience, you think, even now? Curious your thoughts on the larger companies and their systems.
Yeah, I don't know what Cisco's doing anymore today. Since I was there, but I would imagine that you're seeing companies that are trying to diversify a lot more than ever before. I mean, it started with a tariff, which was a complete, you know, wake-up call that came in sort of artificially, but nevertheless, it was like it shocked the whole system and the way you think. Yeah. And when you follow the tariff with this virus thing, I mean, if there's ever a case for thinking, you know, about diversifying, now is the time, and I think it's going to be a lasting thing that supply chain, you know, professionals are gonna follow up and think a lot about.
Yeah, well, and you're like, I don't care if you're a big company, a small company. This concept of trying to do business the same in 2020 versus, you know, it has to be done differently. Yeah,
I think, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if Cisco and other larger companies are just looking at doing more manufacturing more regionally, where maybe they're building, you know, modules, sub-assemblies, subsystems, and then shipping them in to FATP sites that are closer to their customers and more diverse. I wouldn't be surprised to see that.
Go ahead. And I think that regional footprint has been a trend for at least a year, maybe 2 years, and, you know, tariffs brought that home. And this is just a really huge marker to say, hey, you know, diverse footprint's important. And we've certainly had questions come in, you know, mentioning IP, mentioning tariffs, mentioning the current pandemic, and you know, that mix of urgent and important. You know, urgent is to fix what we've got, but important is to say, how are we more prepared next time around? So there's lots of debate around that, but I'm sure that the world and the world of manufacturing and supply chain will be different as a result of this. And my gut feeling is that, interestingly, there are tools in place that can aid that. So that will drive a demand for digital transformation, but we've also built up a tool set for digital transformation, which I think really matches quite well in the current time. Yep. And I think that's important. Few questions coming in from the audience. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, so let's try and get through a couple of those. One of them, I think you can answer, Howell or John, and I think the answer will be the same. When's the right time for a startup to bring in an experienced supply chain manager? And would you kind of, maybe work with a partner first and then bring in a supply chain manager, or maybe bring in a supply chain manager with access to that kind of thing? And I would say straight away, I've met lots of startups that think, we've got someone that knows about materials, we can do that. But supply chain management's a special skill.
Yeah, I would say as soon as possible. It's really important. I mean, just even the role of having somebody that knows the supply chain, knows sourcing, involved in the new product development activity. It's so important to choose the right suppliers and also just be able to assist the development by bringing in the right partners and managing that engagement.
I'll plus one, and then I'll go to Howell. But I think folks wait too long to bring in supply chain professionals and experts. And it can be a leader, it can be someone that's just done a GSM role before. But I think what John's talked about, and we see it with all of our clients, is that the supply chain manager works alongside your engineers, that the best relationships is that they're one-to-one. And too often you have engineers that are playing the role of a supply chain engineer or a supply chain manager, which is bad on a whole bunch of different accords. Engineers are great. I am one. But we're not experts in supply chain. So I would say to this question, there's a lot of great resources, whether it's folks like Howell that we'll hear from you next, but Howell or Fictiv or Dragon or individual consultants or bring them in-house. It's really important. But Howell, is there ever a time when you think it's too early to work with someone?
No, I think absolutely. Even you are still in the design stage of your product, it's the right time to get supply chain people in, because 70% of the product cost is in design stage. They, good supply chain manager can help you figure out what's the best way to define your supply chain network. What's the alternative supplier you have to consider? What's the dual resources, multiple supplier resources you need to consider? And what's, they can figure out a kind of a matrix, why this is good, what you should be aware of.
Yeah. And I think coming from that is the, when you think about this diversity that people are trying to inject in the supply chain, some of that is around the reshoring argument. So, you talk about shifting stuff and having diversity. And, you can use China, but you can also use Thailand, you can use Vietnam, you can use Indonesia, wherever, India. But what about the US? There's substantial capacity there. It's getting more and more competitive as it gets more and more automated. Do you think some innovators, some startups particularly, but also some larger companies ignore what's on their doorstep? Anybody want to take that? John.
It's really interesting that you asked that question, because I'm actually one of my client companies that I'm working with right now is actually has an aspirational goal to manufacture in the U.S. And it's a wonderful thing to work on. I mean, I haven't dealt with a U.S. based supply chain since I was at Ford in the early 90s, and so I think it's going to be an interesting challenge. And I just think that the climate's changing, and I think that this virus has really woken people up to realizing that there may have to be a little bit more cost in the supply chain in order to allow yourself some redundancy and some risk mitigation.
Is that what you think it takes to reshore? Is it it's either you have to be able to relieve on cost constraints a little bit? Like, do you think the talent to do full assembly and these things exists, or what's kind of your view on the probability of that?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are pockets. I'm sure there's some capability here. There's no doubt about it. The question is just how much is available, how much capacity is there, and you know, what types of business make sense to look at, you know, bringing here.
Yeah.
But
yeah. It plays to that. It plays to that picking the right location for the right product. So, you know, I think it can certainly be the case. And you look at the large EMS companies; they still maintain substantial footprints in the US, and they utilize those for quite specific products, sometimes for new product introduction, and then stuff's moved around. So, I think having that, considering that as part of the mix is really important. And then when you go down to parts and you look at things like 3D printing and CNC, Dave, there are loads of great resources in the US. And once you get to total cost of ownership of the product and you actually really study the hidden costs in the supply chain, it can get a lot closer than you originally thought.
We talk a lot about the idea of infrastructure, like where does infrastructure exist to be able to build products? And so that could be at the component machining level. And Howell will be able to explain this better than me, but 30 years ago, Shenzhen was a fishing village still. And the amount of infrastructure that was built around the Pearl River Delta was just phenomenal. And same thing in the Bay Area, in Texas, in Detroit, and kind of the Rust Belt of the United States. There's amazing infrastructure of manufacturing. And so I think it really comes down to the type of product that you're building. And so for consumer electronics, for bikes, it's hard to beat the infrastructure of China, I would say. But if you're making Tesla built a car in the Bay Area, who would have built a factory in Bay Area and build cars in this day and age? I think it's definitely possible for sure.
I think the one thing, just to be realistic, I don't think you can just roll back the clock and everybody gets back into the plastic injection molding business. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. I think the U.S. manufacturers just have to find a way to create value, and differentiated value here in the U.S. And that's got to be customer focused. It's got to be technology. It's got to be something that's just not commoditized.
Yeah, it's right place, right time. That brings me to what I want to do with the last couple of minutes is just put a few takeaways out there. I'm going to throw up a few that I've got, and then I'm going to go around the table and just ask you what you think the key messages people should be taking away. For me, a few things came out. Agility and diverse footprint is huge. So, you know, kind of building that resilience in there as a result of that. One of my headlines from this is you need friends. We all need friends, and those friends are, in this case, are boots on the ground with real expertise. And if you can't get people there, use those that are there already. That's huge. I love the dialogue about communication, open, honest, build trust, build that regular dialogue. And as John really importantly said, ask for help, because, you know, you're partners with these manufacturers. It's not an adversarial relationship. It's all about, particularly now, it's about working together. Designing the right supply chain is huge, doing that as early as possible, right location for the right product. And enterprise and startups are completely different. Sorry if I've stolen everybody's takeaways. No. I'm gonna work my way around. I'm gonna let Dave go next, because I'm sure he's been thinking about this, and then we'll go with Howell and John after that.
Yeah, I think the big thing that I'll push for folks to think about is that China is open for business. And I think that there's a lot of ways that people can continue to leverage it, even in this time of turmoil. And so we're a big believer in infrastructure, whether that's in China or it's in the US or it's in Mumbai. And so that for us, it's all around resilience. And I'll just, push that of have geographic resilience in your supply chain. Don't be reliant on one province, one city, one place, because I think the tariffs have shown that. I think COVID is showing that, and I would just really stress geographic resilience. Yeah. Maybe Hal, any parting advice or words for folks?
Oh, I absolutely agree with all of your points. Supply chain network design is really, really important.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's your background. That's your background, Howell. So getting that supply chain right at the beginning is, everything stems from there. And if you make mistakes early on, you're gonna pay big later. John, what about you in terms of takeaways?
look, I think you guys, Phil, Dave, I think you guys really did a good job of summarizing the key points. I would just actually congratulate you on putting this forum together. I think this is a great idea. I had a great time being here, and I hope you invite me back sometime.
We definitely will. Well, I'll give a round of applause from everyone, and stay safe and be well. And the Supply Chain Bunker lives on and discussing the hottest topics. So thanks everyone for joining, and Phil, John, and Howell, thank you so much.
Thanks
for your time, everybody. See you next time in the bunker. Thank you.
Cool. Bye now.
See you soon. Bye now.